Welcome to Middle Math Academy, Statistical Questions, Dot Plots, and Shape of Data, level number 4. This is part of our differentiated series where we have 5 levels of challenge for every topic. Let's get started. Our learning targets today are: I can determine if a question is statistical or non-statistical and explain why. I can interpret a dot plot and identify the mode, minimum, maximum, and outlier. And I can identify the shape of a data distribution as skewed left, skewed right, or symmetrical. Before we get started with some notes, I want you to pause and rate yourself on these learning targets 1 through 5. 1 is the least confident, 5 is the most confident. At the end of today's lesson, we'll come back and we'll rate ourselves after the lesson to see if our confidence has increased. Let's take a look at our notes. Our first note is on statistical questions, which are questions that expect different answers and need data collection to answer. Variability is the expectation that the question will have different answers. Non-statistical questions are questions that have one fixed answer and do not need data collection. So basically, statistical questions have more than one answer and the answers are different. Non-statistical questions only have one answer. Go ahead and pause the video and write if these two questions where it says A and B, write if each one is statistical or non-statistical and explain why. Then come back to the video to check your work. Let's check our work for A. How many laps can you swim in 30 minutes? Well, if I was answering that question, it would just be one answer. How many laps can I swim? 30 laps. Or whatever the answer is, it's just one answer. So this is a non-statistical question because there is one fixed answer and it does not require data collection. Make sure you have this down. Remember, you can always pause the video if you need more time. Let's check our work for problem B. How many times did each person go to the pool this summer is a statistical question. We're asking more than one person, and we can expect each person to go to the pool different numbers of times. Make sure you have this down, and let's continue with our notes. Before we move on to our dot plot notes, I want to just go back to our learning target. Our first one was determining if a question is statistical or non-statistical, and we just practiced that. Now we're going to move on to our last two learning targets, interpreting a dot plot and identifying the mode, minimum, maximum, and outlier, and then identifying the shape of a data distribution as skewed left, skewed right, or symmetrical. So let's get started with our notes on dot plots. First note for dot plots is a dot plot is a simple way to display data using dots, and you can see a dot plot at the bottom of this page. Each dot on a dot plot represents one data point. We can count all of the data points or all of the dots to find the total number of data points. Measures of central tendency. The mode is a number that shows up the most in the data set. It's a number with the most dots, mode most. The minimum is the smallest number in the data set that has a dot above it. So not the smallest on the number line, the smallest on the number line that has a dot above it. And the maximum's the opposite. It's the largest number in the data set that has a dot above it. Now the outlier is a number that's left out from the rest of the data. Poor old outlier. It's a number in the data set that's much higher or much lower than the other numbers, and it stands out because it only has one or very few dots above or near it. So you can kind of think about the outlier as a number that's sitting by itself at lunch, or it only has like one other person with it. Now let's talk about shapes of data distribution. Skewed right means there's only a little bit of data on the right side. Skewed left, there's only a little bit of data on the left side. Most of the data is on the other side. And then symmetrical's even, okay? So it's when both sides are mostly balanced, like a mirror image. So let's answer some of the questions on our dot plot below. The first question says, what does each dot represent? Each dot represents one person and how many hours they spent exercising per week. So if you're looking for what the dot plot's about, you can always check under the number line and that'll give you a hint. And just remember, every dot represents one person's response. So how many total people were surveyed? Well, we can just count all of our dots. 17 people were surveyed because if we count all of these dots, there are 17 dots. Our next question says, what is the minimum and what is the maximum? Well, our minimum is not 0. That's a common mistake I see from people. There's no numbers above 0, so it's not that. So the minimum is the lowest data point that has a dot above it. So the number between 0 and 2 is 1. So that means our minimum is 1. Our maximum is our highest number with a data point above it, which is 10. So our minimum is 1 and our maximum is 10. Now the outlier, remember the outlier is a piece of data that's left out. So which dot seems furthest away from the rest of the dots? Well, poor old 10 is all by itself. So our outlier is 10. And then our last question is, what is the shape of data? So remember, skewed left is when there's barely any data on the left. Skewed right is when there's barely any data on the right. And symmetrical is when it's pretty even on both sides. So a helpful thing to do, if you're not sure, is you can just sort of draw a line, like a little sketch at the top of your dots. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, and if you're right-handed, you know that this is the right side. This is the left side. So we can see we have not a lot of data on the right. So that means our shape is skewed right. So the data is skewed right because there's only a little data on the right side and most of the data is on the left side. So if it was skewed left, it would look more like this, where there's not a lot of data on the left. Once you're done, filling this in for page 1, go ahead and check in with your teacher. Come back to the video when you're ready for page 2. Page 2 says, determine if each question is statistical or non-statistical and explain why. Complete A and B, then come back to the video to check your work. Check your work for problems A and B. Complete the rest of page 2 on your own. Check in with your teacher to get additional feedback once you finish page 2. Page 3 says, write the total number of participants surveyed for each dot plot. Rate the shape of the data, skewed left, skewed right, or symmetrical, and explain how you know. Go ahead and complete problem A, then come back to the video to check your work. For problem A, to figure out the total amount of people surveyed, you just need to count all of the dots. Once you count all of the dots, you will get 25 as the total. For the shape of the data distribution, remember you can draw a line on the top dot of each column to just try to get a gist of what it'll be, just a little sketch. And you can see that there's not an outlier on the right or left side. So that means the shape of our data distribution is symmetrical because it's pretty balanced on both sides. And then explain how you know the shape of data. The data is symmetrical because the number of people is balanced on both sides of the center with similar numbers at the higher and lower ends. Once you have this down, I want you to complete B and C, then come back to the video. The reason why I asked you to come back after you finish B and C is I just wanted to go over this bottom section where it says create your own dot plot. This is optional if your teacher wants you to do it. If you're unable to survey your classmates, you could just make up the data. I put a little checklist here so you can make sure you have all the components of a dot plot. And when in doubt, look at examples that we've already done. Okay, so if you can't survey your classmates, just create data based on what you think their responses would be. Once you finish page 3, check in with your teacher. On page 4, complete the problems under A, then come back to the video to check your work. Our first question is, what does each dot represent? Each dot represents the number of books one student read in middle school, and you can find what the dot plot is about by looking under the number line. Our next question says, how many people were surveyed in the dot plot? Well, we can just count our total number of dots, and there are 21 people who were surveyed because there are 21 total dots. Next question, what is the minimum? The minimum is 0 books because the smallest number with a dot above it is 0. What is the maximum? If you said 10, that's a common mistake. It is not 10 because there's no dot above 10. There's no data. There's no one who read 10 books in middle school. So the maximum is 9 because it's the largest number with a dot above it. What is the mode? Remember, mode, most. Most dots is 0. What is the outlier? Oh, the poor outlier who's all by themselves at lunch. Number 9, it's the data that's far away from the other data. Sometimes there might not be an outlier. With symmetrical data, you usually won't see an outlier. And then write the shape of data. Okay, so we can kind of just draw a sketch at the top of each dot. And I can see that there's not a lot of data on the right. You're looking for where there's not a lot of data. If there's not a lot of data on the right, it is skewed right. And then the last question, or second to last question, how many students read at least 3 books in middle school? Okay, so at least 3. So we're going to include 3. But if they read at least 3, they could have also read 4 or any of the numbers this way. So we're going to count all of these dots, and we have 6. So 6 students read at least 3 books. 3 students read 3 books, 2 students read 4 books, and 1 student read 9 books. Once you have this down, complete the rest of page 4 on your own, then check in with your teacher. Complete all of page 5 on your own, then check in with your teacher. And complete all of page 6. Come back to the video once you finish this entire page. We're only going to go over one problem, but come on back once you finish this entire page. Let's look at common misconception problem number 1. True or false? A dot plot with most of the data clustered on the left and a few points stretched out to the right is called skewed right. Explain. The answer is true. Remember, if there's only a few pieces of data on the right, it's skewed right. So skewed right means there's only a little data on the right with most of the data on the left. We're going to go over one more, common misconception problem number 2. In your own words, explain what an outlier is on a dot plot. An outlier on a dot plot is a data point that is much further from the other data points, is much different from the other data points. Outliers are usually far away from the rest of the dots, either much higher or much lower. Now that you've finished all of page 6, as promised, you're going to go back to our first page. Then rate yourself after the lesson on our learning targets now that you've gotten some more practice. After you're done rating yourself, check in with your teacher to get additional feedback. Thank you for joining us today at Middle Math Academy, where we practice statistical questions, dot plots, and shape of data, level number 4. This is part of our differentiated series where we have 5 levels of challenge for every topic. If you're looking for any additional practice, make sure to check out level number 1, level 2, level 3, or our most challenging level, level number 5. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.